Generally, if a lease is silent, tenants have the right to transfer their interest in the property to another party. However, landlords can limit this ability to transfer by putting in a clause in the lease that requires the tenant to get the consent of the landlord before they transfer the lease. So, what do these consents clauses look like? And do they say what the landlord requires in order to give their consent? Well, there are three possibilities. The clause could be what's called a sole discretion clause. The sole discretion clause states that the landlord can choose to withhold his consent for any reason that he would like. The second possibility is that the landlord puts a reasonableness standard into the lease. That would require the landlord to only withhold consent if he has a commercially reasonable basis to withhold the consent. The third possibility is that the lease requires that the landlord give consent before there is transfer, but the lease is silent as to what standard the landlord will use to give that consent, or what needs to happen in order for the landlord's consent to be given. So it is called a silent standard, or a silent clause. And that is the issue that's dealt with in Kendall v. Ernst. So the issue is, what standard should the courts apply when the lease is silent as to which standard the landlord should use when deciding if they would consent to the transfer of property. So when there is a silent clause, what standard should the courts apply? The court opined the majority rule is that if the lease is silent, then the default is the sole discretion clause, and the landlord can withhold his consent for any reason that he or she chooses. You can do so for arbitrary reasons. But the minority rule, which is the rule that the court follows, and the more modern rule, is that if the lease is silent, then the default is the reasonableness standard. So that would require the landlord to give a commercially reasonable reason when withholding their consent. And if they can't give a commercially reasonable reason, then the consent shouldn't be withheld. The court spends most of the opinion talking about what is or isn't commercially reasonable, and I strongly suggest that you spend some time outlining the examples the court gives. The reason this case is so useful in teaching restrictions on tenant transfers is that it gives many examples of what is and what isn't commercially reasonable. So I would make sure I take the time to outline what is and isn't commercially reasonable in this case.